Hey everybody, we just would like to let you know we're officially now on iTunes, we're also on SoundCloud, and we're also on YouTube. You can look us up at Palm Beach County Young Dems or PBCYD. If you could leave us a rating or a review or comments about our interviews, it is greatly appreciated. The resurgence of the KKK, otherwise known as the Ku Klux Klan, in the 1920s is the focus of Linda Gordon's latest book, The Second Coming of the KKK. Linda's academic background informs her deep concerns with our society's civil injustices. With this latest work, she delves into the resurrection of the KKK with all its rabid intention of building a long-lasting institution. Despite their best efforts, it crumbled under their own subversive greed. In our discussion, we explore the various factions within the KKK and how they relate to the modern resurgence of white nationalism in current political climate. You're a historian. For most of your career, you've written on feminism. You actually have written the definitive history of the political movement around birth control in the U.S., and you've actually won multiple awards, including the Bancroft Prize twice, which is extremely rare. So what got you actually interested in women's history?
Oh, well, early in my career, the massive women's movement happened at the end of the 60s and early 1970s, so that was it.
What got you interested into researching and diving into the KKK?
Well, it was actually originally a chapter in a larger book, which is a book about social movements in the 20th century U.S., which I will soon go back to. But that chapter was actually drafted quite some time ago, and then, maybe, 6-7 years ago. But then Trump happened, and my editor and my agent and a number of colleagues said, really, you should try to put that out now. So I took a chapter that had been written earlier, and I worked very hard to expand it into a book. So that's how that happened. But you're right, it is the only time I've ever written about the right wing, and it will probably be the last time.
You just mentioned that Trump happened, which is kind of common to hear from a lot of people, that things changed as soon as he got elected. So Why focus on the 1920s movement of the KKK?
Oh, well, that's very simple, because I'm really an historian, and I am not at all an expert on contemporary white nationalism or other aspects of the kind of racist right, if you want to call it that. And so that isn't something that I could have contributed. I do not ever present myself as an expert on contemporary politics, but of course, it's impossible not to see the connections between organizations of the past, like the KKK, and what's going on today.
It's commonly believed there's been about 3 to 4 waves of the KKK, and we're just talking about how your book is focusing on the revival in the 1920s. So, could you explain to me where this revival came from? Were they, connected to the original incarnation of the KKK?
Sure. They certainly believed that they were and always claimed that they were, but they were, first of all, different in one really important respect. You have to keep in mind that in the 1920s, or especially at the beginning of the 1920s, there actually were very few African Americans living in the North, and even fewer living in the West. So to try to revive a KKK that was singularly focused on African Americans, like the first one was, that would not have had any traction in the North. But what gave birth to this impulse, I think, were 2 different things. One is the really massive immigration into the United States that began in the 1880s, an immigration that was, we should keep in mind, both in sheer numbers and in proportion to the whole population, was far, far greater than what we have seen in the last few decades. But what was characteristic of this immigration that started in the 1880s is that very few of these immigrants were white Protestants. They were primarily Catholics from Southern Europe, Jews from Eastern Europe, Russian and Greek Orthodox from those parts of the world, and even the Near East. And it was those groups, Catholics, Jews, Russian Orthodox, who were perceived as immigrants who did not belong in the United States. And that was an old tradition that has often been called nativism by historians. But the great numbers of the immigration in that turn-of-the-century period was something new. The second source, I think, was World War I. Not so much the war itself, but what happened afterwards. I think maybe not a lot of people understand that. Immediately after World War I, there was a really wild attack on dissent of any kind in the United States, which even resulted in the deportation of many people because their ideas were considered too radical. And I think that gave rise to a new phenomenon that we had to defend ideological conformity in the United States. And that was another very important aspect of the 1920s KKK. In other words, it was not only anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic, but it was very, very much pushing this kind of heightened patriotism in which there was a real danger from people who did not have the right ideology in the United States.
So you mentioned that the second formation of this KKK wasn't only really against black people, as the original formation was down in the South, because now this is in the North and in the West, and there's not a lot of blacks, so it became this anti-Catholic and anti-Jew. But in your book, you also talk about how they pretty much almost hated everyone. At least it seemed like, they were against Protestants.
No, they were Protestants themselves.
Right, that's my mistake.
The Klan was essentially a white evangelical Protestant operation.
You're right, my mistake there. So, who revived the KKK?
Well, it was started by one single guy called William Simmons, who didn't last very long. But in order to understand what he was doing, you have to understand something else that I know to many people seems kind of odd when you're talking about a big social movement. The Ku Klux Klan was a for-profit corporation, and it was incorporated as such. And Simmons got into the idea as a money-making operation. And while it expanded and became very, very heavily ideological, it was always a huge money-making operation. And that is actually one of the major reasons why after a really enormous, rapid growth, up to 6 million members by the mid-1920s, by the late 1920s, it had shrunk down to just a tiny fraction of itself. And one major part of the reason for that was that its members basically were just getting soaked for dues, for constant additional expenses and fees for purchasing the robes and so on. And I think many of them began to say, well, what is really going on here? They don't seem to be really doing anything except wanting to raise money. And there was a lot of truth in that, and the national figures in the Klan really enriched themselves through this movement.
Yeah, as I was reading your book, it sounds like they basically kind of created a pyramid scheme here.
Absolutely. You're totally right. Exactly. Because, if I recruit you, I get to keep 40% of your initiation fee. And that initiation fee, incidentally, was very high. A lot of people had the false impression that the Ku Klux Klan was an organization of sort of poor and down and out people, and that is not at all true. It was very middle class. So, I get to keep 40% of your initiation fee, but then you can go out and recruit someone else and keep 40% of that, and this pyramid goes on, and it has the problem of a lot of pyramid schemes that after a time you just run out of people to recruit in your community, and then you become embittered and disillusioned.
To back up, you talked about William Joseph Simmons, who restarts this KKK. Now, so he basically kind of started this for-profit corporation with the name, and as you're saying, it becomes this giant pyramid scheme. He didn't last long. So what would cause the downfall of him?
Well, this happened consistently with a lot of Klan leaders. A combination of incompetence in some cases, hypocrisy, particularly sexual exploits and drinking. You have to remember that this was the period of prohibition, and the Klan, like all other evangelical Protestants, were strong supporters of prohibition, and they liked to claim that it was only Catholics who drank, which was, of course, nonsense, and leaders kept being caught drinking, as well as in other kind of sexual immorality. So, there are various tales about one after another. But it's also true that Simmons was just not a very politically savvy person, and his successors were more efficient at really building this corporation.
You're mentioning the hypocrisy of these members of the KKK and leadership. So one of the things that really, in a way, kind of made me laugh, and again, kind of in a dark way, was that William Simmons decided, he created a photo op of the Klan, but the picture was paid black people in these robes, if I understood what you're saying.
Yes. Yeah, there are a lot of these really kind of bizarre, funny slips, but I think these were publicity stunts, and they were never really completely systematic. But on the other hand, in the period after Simmons, Simmons was really kind of a weak-kneed joker of a figure, but under Hiram Evans, the major imperial wizard, as the head of the KKK was called, they were really doing very, very serious damage. And even though some of what they did is laughable, as a whole, this was not something laughable, because they contribute to making anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism respectable. They were just, they had 150 different press publications, and they owned 2 radio stations. And, we have to remember that these were the social media of the 1920s. And they were just pushing out this really quite vile bigotry all over the country, and really they were really succeeding in shifting public opinion.
You mentioned how they were using the social media of their time. So obviously there wasn't Twitter, there wasn't Facebook, and all these other things that we have nowadays, and how this organization grew massively after William was gone. So 2 people that you mentioned that joined not too long after he restarted the Klan was Edward Clark and Bessie Tyler. And they played a pivotal role in getting this organization rolling. Can you tell me what they did?
Well, they organized a PR firm, and this is interesting because it's probably the first occasion in which we have a social movement hiring a professional PR firm to promote it. Of course, they did so with a contract that gave them just an enormous percentage of what they took in, and this is part of William Simmons's kind of stupidity, really. They were extremely effective, but they too then got caught in immoral behavior, which they supposedly were against.
What's really interesting, you touched on it briefly earlier, is that the common belief of the Klan is that it was from the South and it was full of hicks and idiots. But you mentioned in your book that that's far from the truth, and that they were not, like you just said, they were middle-class citizens.
Right.
So what I guess is interesting here, because you also talk about in your book that not everyone who joined the Klan exactly believed in their ideals, but that it was just kind of recognized as this regular organization.
Well, I think it's a matter of degree. It is certainly true that in many, many locations, people joined the Klan because it was sort of a bandwagon effect, because other people were there. In fact, in some ways, the Klan began to operate in many of its locals like what we would today call a Rotary Club, a location for networking that could be beneficial. So you might find jobs, you might find customers for your business, etc. And in many ways, the Klan was not only respectable, but it included some of the quote-unquote leading citizens, which made it very desirable to be a part of that. But I don't think that means that people did not accept its really virulent hostility to Catholics and Jews. I mean, the stuff that they were spewing out, the fake news, they're just bizarre stories about how horrible these groups were and how they were seeking to undermine America. This stuff really caught on. I think people really believed it.
What's really interesting is because we're talking here about how there's different local branches, and in your book you mentioned how they didn't always share the same ideals, so maybe in some areas they were more anti-Catholic than others. So what I guess I find really interesting is that, because you also mentioned earlier, was that this became like this very evangelical group, and that there's two people that really stood out in your book that you wrote about, and one was Daisy Barr and the other was Reverend Alma White. So could you tell me a little about these women?
Sure. Alma White is really a very remarkable person. She founded a kind of what you would call rather sectarian Protestant church that still exists with its headquarters in New Jersey. And she was really ambitious and extremely productive. I think there are just dozens of books of her collected sermons that were published. Now, she never was officially an officer of the Ku Klux Klan. And, of course, we have to remember that the Ku Klux Klan itself was a male organization. There was a women's auxiliary, but the main Klan was male. But she had, again, this very, very deeply anti-Catholic orientation. In her case, more anti-Catholic than anti-Semitic, but certainly a little of both. But she was extremely unusual. First of all, that she was not only a minister, but in her rather small Protestant group, she had herself declared a bishop, which really didn't mean much because it was such a small group. But on the other hand, in other ways, she was just typical of the whole evangelical base that was the base for the Klan. And it had some ideologies that were very important that were not in themselves racist. One of them was prohibition, which I mentioned. The other one was extreme hostility to evolutionary theory. This is the period in the famous Scopes trial when a school teacher was prosecuted for having the nerve to mention evolution in his classroom. And in that sense, she is a little bit like what we would today call fundamentalists. People who believe that every word of the Bible has to be taken literally. Of course, that's, in a way, a very bizarre claim because everything we read in the Bible, at least in this country, has been translated, and there are many different translations and arguments about which ones are correct. But nevertheless, that is one of the core aspects of that kind of evangelical Protestantism. Daisy Barr is a little different, and I included her partly because I think today, because she was a Quaker, and today I think people have a general image of the Quakers as a fairly liberal Protestant group. But that was not necessarily the case in that day, and it was not necessarily the case in her region, where she was just as bigoted as any of the worst.
You've mentioned a couple times, we've talked about it a little bit, that this was really an evangelical group. Now, I'm not a very big biblical scholar here, but it seems, to me at least, from my basic knowledge, is that these anti-Semitic views, wouldn't they contradict what's supposed to be taught in the Bible?
How so?
Well, I mean, again, I'm not a big scholar here, so I'm going off.
You're thinking about the Old Testament, is that right?
Well, I was thinking about equality. Doesn't the Bible teach you about equality?
Oh. Well, it's all a matter of interpretation, isn't it? There are a lot of people who are still today argue that, say the Bible means that there should not be equality for women. I mean, all of this is a matter of interpretation, but I think we have to remember that the main stream of thought has to do with the story that the Jews killed Christ and the Jews betrayed this new Christian movement. But, I am not sure I think that matters, because I think what I'm inclined to say is that you can take the Bible and have it mean anything you want it to mean.
Okay. So you briefly mentioned about how the KKK was this male group. And I got to tell you, about, I want to say maybe halfway through your book, you talk about how there's this feminist movement within the KKK. Yeah. And I got to tell you, it threw me off because at first I was like, oh, good for them. They're fighting for equality. And then I had to remind myself that these were really horrible people.
Yeah, I did that chapter deliberately. Obviously, it's true, but I wanted to make that point. And I also knew when I wrote it that is the chapter that would cause me the most flack, because I think there are a lot of people, including some of my good friends, who would like to think or have the impression that feminists are always progressive and egalitarian on a whole lot of issues. And that's simply not true. There are people who can argue for feminist causes or feminist gains confined to the small privileged group that they belong to. And to some extent, the 20s Klan, gave a little sort of passive support to this because they understood that since after women got the vote in 1920, that could just mean more votes for their causes, especially because in the 1920s, as we know, African Americans who were mostly in the South were almost completely disfranchised, and also many of the immigrant Catholics and Jews were not yet citizens, and so they couldn't vote. So the addition of all these white evangelical women to the voting rolls would be very advantageous to the Klan. But it's also true that women in the Klan were genuinely critical of the legal and economic disadvantages that women had to deal with at that particular time. You have to remember that what we're talking about is a time not just when women may have just got the vote, but they were still, they could not buy property in their own name if they were married. They could not get credit. They could often not serve on juries. There's just one after another of these laws, traditional laws, that excluded women from citizenship that were still in place.
We're talking about this feminist movement and how it kind of contradicts, not necessarily contradicts, but it tears at people's feelings towards it. Like I just said, it caught me off guard. And another thing that was really interesting was that, again, the KKK, some of their beliefs would mesh up with progressive causes. Like, I believe at one point there was a ballot measure in Oregon for just public schools and banning private schools, and they supported that. They were pro-welfare. They were against large military. So it's just interesting to see how that interconnects there. So why were they all of a sudden for public schools?
Oh, well, they were only for public schools because they wanted to prohibit Catholic schools. I don't think they had any real deep notion of public schools in the sense that we do. But you also have to remember that even though they supported what they called public schools, they also wanted to have Protestant religion taught in those schools. They were certainly not in favor of the separation of church and state.
So, again, what's interesting to me is that I believe at one point there was an Oregon governor race, and you talk about how there was at least the 3 big utility companies were supporting the Klan, if I understood that. So why are these utility companies backing the Klan?
Well, they backed them partly because they just shared those beliefs. But I also think that because of the way that the Klan had a lot of status in those communities, that the Klan chapters were groups in which they felt comfortable. It was their sort of people. I don't think that the Klan had, let me put it this way, I don't think that the number of the very rich, of the sort of big business people who were in the Klan was, greater than their overall proportion in the society. I think the primary base of the Klan were people in what we would call small business and other middle-class occupations, sometimes working-class people, but only working-class people who were really a kind of elite of the working class because of the cost of belonging, The initiation fee itself it's $10, but that was worth what is today probably about $120. So this is not cheap. And of course, you kept having to put in more money for regular dues, for buying things, and so on. But I don't think that the Klan was particularly strong among the very rich.
Right, so that's an interesting point you're making here, because on one hand, the Klan preached what we would maybe label populism. I know that's a very broad definition, but they would say they were anti-elite and that they were against the rich. But they never exactly backed that up, that retort.
I don't actually think they were against the rich at all. I think they and this is the way in which they are very similar to what you see today, that Trump, for example, is often called a populist, as if he's appealing to the sort of common people, but in fact, his policies are those that favor the very, very rich. The Klan never, ever, ever, to the best of my knowledge, ever supported any policy that could economically help middle-class or working-class people. They were extremely convinced, most of them, that people got rich because they deserved to be rich, because they were smart and ambitious. They even honored what we might call ruthlessness in the way that people built their businesses.
Your book talks about, and it's really insane and it's dangerous, is that the Klan wasn't just this group that we think of just these nut jobs, but they were actually getting public officials elected. I can't remember exactly, but I think it was like 10 or 11 governorships they won.
That's right. They were enormously successful politically, and they had a very sophisticated political lobbying strategy. As you just said, they elected 11 governors, 45 members of Congress, and probably in several thousand state, local, county officials. They did this by a very sophisticated get-out-the-vote operation in which they really pressured Klan members to vote and to vote for Klan candidates. They intimidated politicians or candidates for political office by suggesting that if you didn't go along with the Klan, that they would smear you in some way or another by calling you a Jew lover or a Catholic lover or immoral or something like that. And they were very, very successful for this period of time. After the Klan declined in the late 1920s, you didn't see that many elected officials, because when I'm talking about elected officials, I'm talking about people who ran for office as Klansmen. But when the Klan declined, I don't think we should assume that that meant that its ideology declined, because I think a lot of people in the Klan continued to harbor that kind of bigotry. And one of the things that we do know is that in the 1930s, many, certainly don't know how many, but many Klansmen became supporters of the neo-Nazi and neo-fascist groups that were developing in the United States. Now, none of these ever reached the size of the Klan. You know, we're talking about groups called the National Socialists of America, the Silver Shirts, the Brown Shirts, etc. But it does show that the Klan political orientation was very, very comfortable with European Nazism and fascism.
So, to back up here, so we're talking about how the Klan had a lot of elected officials that ran as official Klan members, and you talked about how they had the sophisticated get-out-the-vote effort. And what I found really interesting, actually, was that they would have carnivals. They had sports teams.
Right.
You talk about how they had a baseball team at one point.
Oh, they had many baseball teams, yeah. Yeah, no, they were also very, very good at this kind of putting on these kind of mass events that were very attractive to people. And the advantage of these kind of carnival things, which are often held on July 4th, is that they were out in the open. Anyone could come, whether you were a Klan sympathizer or not. And they did help to promote the idea that the Ku Klux Klan was just an all-American kind of public organization. The fact is that the anti-Catholicism and the anti-Semitism was, on the one hand, very widespread, but one of the things that's interesting about it is that the Klan managed to rev up this kind of bigotry even in places where there were hardly any Catholics or Jews. You know, in some ways, the Catholics and the Jews were imaginary enemies. You know, that not only was there no evidence of their doing anything to erode American constitutional principles, but in fact, Catholics and Jews at that period of time were somewhat more confined to a few large cities on the East Coast. Now, it is also true that on the West Coast you had a very different situation, because on the West Coast, varying places, you had very significant populations of Mexican Americans and of Asian Americans, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans. And before you mentioned the Klan flexibility, which is a very good point, because in the West, they sort of went after or targeted the groups that were the out-groups in that location. And again, you have to remember the spread of the population. For example, on the East Coast, in the 1920s, I bet very, very few people had ever seen a Japanese American. This kind of population was still pretty confined to the West.
Right, so you actually mentioned how they were in large cities, and what's really interesting about that is, again, you know, we talked about how the Klan had this image, it was modern belief, I should say, or the group belief was that, again, there was these rural backwater people, and I just want to hit on this point that you were saying they had large memberships in cities. They had over thousands of members.
They did. However, their proportion in a city like New York was nowhere near as great as it would have been, say, in a city like Indianapolis. For obvious reasons, New York City was filled with immigrants, and, you know, there's something about living in a city like New York where people just are more comfortable with diversity. I think if you want to get to talk about this sort of psychological basis of Klan ideas, you're talking about a group of people who really don't like diversity. They feel like they want to be part of a society in which everyone is alike. Everyone is alike religiously, everyone is alike racially, everyone is alike ideologically. And I think in many ways that perspective doesn't work very well in large cities, because what a large city is almost by definition a place where you have all sorts of different groups of people living there.
You have an interesting story in your book about how a labor union actually got into a fight with the Klan at one point. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the Klan's attitude toward labor unions was complicated because in some cases, labor unions were, say, in the big mining towns, you had a lot of Slavic immigrants who were not Protestant. And in those kind of cases, the Klan was very hostile to them. On the other hand, where you had predominantly white Protestant unions, the Klan could get along with them very well. Now, one thing I should emphasize that we haven't talked about yet is that the Northern Klan was mainly nonviolent. Not exclusively, but mainly. But they liked to be provocative. For example, one of the things they loved to do is to paste leaflets for their meetings on the walls of synagogues or Catholic churches. Actually try to conduct major demonstrations at Notre Dame University, where they literally got run off. But they were so provocative that some of the violence was actually initiated by opponents of the Klan, people who would throw things at them when they were marching in, and some very few occasions actually shoot at them. But the violence was mainly marginal in this period in the North. And the Klan, I think, had learned a really important lesson, that they would get much further through electoral politics than they could ever achieve through violence.
So you mentioned how they're mostly nonviolent, obviously, with few incidents here in between. So the original incarnation of the Klan was what, during the Civil War era, right before, pre-Civil War, after?
right after the Civil War. The first Klan was really a classic example of what we would today call a terrorist organization. Its main strategy was violence, and this was violence directed against black people, and that violence had a classic terrorist purpose. In other words, when they were lynching people, they were not just punishing individuals that they had a grievance against, but they were sending a message to the whole African American community, which basically said, don't mess with us or you will be sorry. In other words, they wanted to incite fear. That is the essence of terrorism. In that sense, the Northern Klan was not terrorist. They were intimidating, and they tried to intimidate people. But that's a little different than an organization whose main tactic was violence.
Right, so to fast forward, there's two things I found really interesting. Obviously, so we know President Woodrow Wilson gets elected president, and he decides to resegregate the government, and he actually holds a private screening of Birth of a Nation. And Birth of a Nation was that racist movie about the black people raping white women, if I remember exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And so to fast forward some more, so that I imagine played a lot of movement into anti-Semitic beliefs in the country, obviously with the president encouraging it, and we can correlate that with today's modern day president, with Donald Trump and his anti-Semitism and encouraging it. So what I also found really interesting was that the Klan actually worked in the police department, or were either official police officers or they were working with them.
Yes, there was a very, very large number of Klan members were police officers, and vice versa. Many police were Klanspeople. But, you know, that is something that is significant among all kinds of white nationalist groups. It's true today. That's one thing I know, that law and order officials are likely to be much more sympathetic. The Klan actually like to work with police officials in enforcing prohibition. The other aspect of what you might call violence is that many locations, Klansmen were allowed to go with cops on raids of saloons and bootleggers who were manufacturing liquor. Once there was no prohibition, I think it's a slightly different point of view, but you can be sure that the vast majority of law and order officials in the 1920s were white Protestants, so they were entirely comfortable with a group like the Klan.
Right. So you talk about how they were, again, they're pretty nonviolent. Again, we just talked about how they can intersect with the police, and there were still incidents of violence, and they were anti-saloon. So why were they so against prohibition when you also have mentioned earlier that these members were still drinking? Wouldn't they be anti-prohibition, if anything?
No, the whole, just about all the evangelical Protestant sects were against drinking. What we're talking about is hypocrisy, not, something that makes any logical sense. They were also against adultery, but many of them got caught having sex with women they weren't married to. The world is full of that kind of hypocrisy. So it's not surprising, but it was part of this evangelical notion of purity, and a purity that was associated psychologically with whiteness, in the sense of the white race, but it's also symbolized by the white robes, etc.
So you just mentioned the white robes, and we know the white hoods, what they're very famous for, but you also mentioned in your book that as you climbed the ladder in the hierarchy, that you had different colored robes, and the Imperial Dragon, I believe the leader of the Klan, wore a purple outfit. Why specifically purple?
I don't know the significance of the purple, but it's only the very, very top leadership that wore colored robes. You did sometimes have colored sashes, colored insignia. They were not entirely 100% systematic about what you wore, but the white robe with that hood was absolutely basic for 99% of all the members.
And to follow up on that there is that you also mentioned how, for the most part, they would wear these hoods, but that in certain states you could not wear these masks. So they would hold parades and they'd march in the outfit without the mask, but that actually increased their popularity.
Yeah, some states tried to fight back by passing these regulations that said you couldn't parade with a mask, but it just didn't work, and it didn't work because there really was absolutely nothing secret about the Klan. The mask was not a functional way of keeping it secret who belonged, because there were many, many other ways in which people were completely public about being members of the Klan. So that's another major difference on the surface with the Southern Klan, which theoretically was a secret organization. But the Southern Klan, we know that was actually primarily a false claim, and that in most communities of the South, people knew perfectly well who were members of the Klan. But secrecy was absolutely not important to the Northern Klan, and the purpose of the mask was somehow sort of this tradition, but it had nothing to do with trying to keep people from knowing who the people were.
What, and ultimately dropped the Klan? Because it sounds like in your book that it was basically a 5-year period where they had grown to this huge national following, and then they just died off fast.
Right. Well, I wish I could say that the Klan declined because there was a large organized public movement to denounce them. There was a lot of opposition, but there certainly was no large social movement against them. They really declined mainly from internal reasons. I mentioned before that members just got sick and tired of just being dunned for this fee and that fee, and you have in some minutes cases in which members are saying, well, I'm just not sure what this organization does. It seems like the only thing the organization does is to collect money. Then they were a little undone by the evidence of hypocrisy, that they made big stands against drinking and they were caught drinking. They made stands against sexual immorality and they were caught in that way. Then there was one final case that was so horrendous that it actually got national coverage in every newspaper in the country. This is when, and it is the first and only time in the 1920s that a Klansman was actually convicted of anything. And this is another way in which their relationship with the police usually protected them. But this guy, who was obviously really kind of deranged, the Grand Goblin of Indiana, he was actually convicted of kidnapping, raping, and torturing, as well as murdering his female assistant. It was really kind of shocking, and he was a very, very high, he was sort of second in the country to the Imperial Wizard. So this was, I think, a last straw for a lot of people in the Klan. But I also think just a lot of people got bored with it. I think people were attracted and they thought, oh, this is kind of fun, and we do all this kind of abracadabra. They had all these codes and rituals that they did. But when you just do that over and over again, it loses its charm.
I want to end on this right here. In your belief, in your opinion, because you say that maybe people didn't run as official Klan members, but they still held their beliefs. Is the official Klan still threaded from the Second Coming that you write about, or are they a whole new different brand?
Well, it's kind of murky, but today the Ku Klux Klan is only one very small group among the many, many white nationalist groups. Whereas in the 1920s, it was the dominant group speaking for white Protestant supremacy in the North. But in fact, the Second Klan was theoretically still a part of the First Klan, and even though they did not concentrate their ideology on hatred of blacks, they certainly went along with that. Then there was, again, a revival in the midst of the civil rights movement. But then, like today, the Klan was one part, but just one part of this white hostility to any civil rights for black people, very related to what were called the White Citizens Councils. And then today, again, the Klan still exists. It still considers itself part of a national organization, but it is simply no longer a major one, a major figure. But on the other hand, the situation today, as the best that I understand it, is there is no one organization that pulls together all these white nationalists. There are many, many small groups, and they don't even all get along with each other. So it is a very different situation. But there's a big difference, and that is that despite their massive strength in the 20s, and despite the fact that President Woodrow Wilson was very sympathetic, at least to their racist views, Woodrow Wilson did not use his position as president to promote this kind of bigotry. And the situation right after the Civil Rights Movement was different, because there you had the highest officials in the states who were supporting it and promoting that kind of bigotry. And today we have a president and people at the very top in the nation who are promoting those kind of ideas. So I think whenever you look at the Klan, you also have to think about how does it sit in relation to other governmental officials.
Well, Linda, listen, I once again am so appreciative of your time, and thank you so much.
Well, I thank you for your interest in this.
Is there anything that you're currently working on that I could be expecting in the near future?
Well, it's not going to be anything right-wing, because I found it actually very unpleasant to be sort of saturated with this hate talk. But I think I will go back to the place that the Klan study came out of, and that was a study of social movements in the United States. But I think most of the social movements I'm talking about will be far more constructive than progressive ones.
Well, that sounds great. I look forward to your future work. Thanks again, Linda.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Once again, I'd like to thank Linda Gordon for taking time out of her busy schedule to talk to me about her latest book, The Second Coming of the KKK. On her page, I put a link to where you can purchase the book if you'd like to learn more about the KKK in the 1920s. Thank you.